Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to be talking about the threats of nuclear weapons, and my guest is an expert on this topic. Ward Wilson is the founder and executive director of RealistRevolt. He is widely acknowledged as the leading source of innovative, pragmatic arguments against nuclear weapons in the world today. The title of his recent book is It Is Possible: A Future Without Nuclear Weapons. Ward Wilson, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
It's great to be with you, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me. We're going to get into your book very shortly, but let's talk a little bit about this landscape today. As I recall, there are about 12,500 nuclear weapons in the world today, roughly, more or less.
Yes.
And there are 9 nuclear states. Is that about right?
The United States, Russia, Great Britain, France, China, Israel, India, Pakistan, North Korea.
Exactly. Okay, so still 9. And some countries, with all of the instability and all of the loose talk going around, some countries have threatened to go nuclear, like Saudi Arabia, Japan. How disastrous would that be if we start adding on countries?
Well, the problem with nuclear weapons is that it's easy to make mistakes when you're handling something that is as extreme as a nuclear weapon, by which I mean that it's easy for people's emotions to get carried away and they could potentially use them. The more people that have them, the less safe the world is.
That's exactly right. That's the exact way to put it, I think. You're quite right. Yeah. I've heard, again, more loose talk from people who really don't know much about the situation, in my opinion. Some members of our Congress in the United States talking about how, well, we could have a limited nuclear exchange. We heard Putin not long ago say he might use limited nuclear weapons in Ukraine. How realistic is that to even think you could have a limited nuclear exchange? And what would be the fallout, especially as it would apply to a nuclear winter in the world?
Well, there are two things. In the early 70s, Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger said, the Soviets could carry out a limited surgical strike on U.S. nuclear forces. And 2 very astute physicists, Frank von Hippel and I'm going to forget his name, did a study of a surgical strike in which they imagined targeting just the nuclear silos, the air bases where the U.S. has bombers, and the 2 submarine bases. And what they found is that, the silos are far out in the center of the United States, but the radiation that comes with each ground burst explosion would blow on the wind. And given typical March winds, you'd have 20 million Americans killed just from the radiation blowing across St. Louis, Chicago, and so on. In terms of nuclear winter, the available evidence is that even a smallish war where cities are destroyed, ash and debris are carried up into the stratosphere above the level of clouds. And so they stay there, hanging suspended over the earth, and in effect creating a giant shade that would lower temperatures, affect crops, cause starvation. And you could have, even from a relatively small, if our predictions about what happens to cities when they're destroyed by a nuclear explosion are correct, even a relatively small war, 20, 30 weapons, 50, could cause massive devastation because of the change in temperature and the loss of the ability to grow food around the world.
It would be absolutely disastrous. And it's really just ridiculous to even broach the subject, to even think we could have limited exchanges. It just would not work. We've always heard, it's easy to get into a war, it's hard to get out of it, and there are always unintended consequences. And that has held true with every skirmish ever from the beginning of time, probably. Well, before I forget it, let me mention your website so our viewers can go to that at www realistrevolt.org to get more information on what we're talking about and many of the issues today. Well, let's focus a little bit on your book. It is possible, a future without nuclear weapons. What is the main thrust of that book? And we'll get into some of the highlights as we go through it.
The idea fundamentally is that while the damage and destruction that nuclear weapons could cause is real, their utility and their importance have been exaggerated. The reputation of nuclear weapons is a little like one of those stocks in the stock market that people get all excited about, and they drive the price up and up and up and up. And eventually it reaches stratospheric levels that have nothing to do with reality. And that's the way the reputation of nuclear weapons is. So the book's argument is that we need to return from this kind of overinflated view of nuclear weapons. They're the apocalypse. They're the end of everything. They're the most powerful weapon on the face of the earth. They're useful in every situation. To a more realistic view, because if you have a piece of technology and it's not very useful and it's very dangerous, say you have a stove that can't boil water, but also has a tendency to self-ignite and burn down your house. That's not a piece of technology that you would ever buy. And if you owned one, you'd get rid of one. You'd get rid of it as soon as you figured out that that was its characteristics. So the book makes the argument that it's possible to get rid of nuclear weapons if we deflate their reputation.
How would we go about deflating their reputation? Seems like a logical thing to do, but how would we do that?
Well, you look at history, you look at the facts, and you look with an objective eye, and then you relate what you find to people. And the thing is, when survival is on the line, people want the most realistic plan possible. When their life is at risk, people don't say, I want some kind of imaginary, idealistic solution. Well, some people say that, but they're saints. Most people say, I want the best plan for surviving. So in a world where nuclear weapons exist, obviously, if there's a problem with nuclear weapons, then our survival is at risk. Realistic arguments about how useful they are and how dangerous they might be will land with a lot of force, it seems to me. So all we need to do is make the case that they're not very useful and that they're dangerous. And then the conditions are set. You know, you wait a little while because it takes some time for the reputation to go on. But think about it. After people realized that biological weapons were not very useful, how many years did it take for there to be a treaty banning biological weapons? 2 years. So once everyone agrees that the weapons aren't very dangerous, it's pretty straightforward to get a treaty going.
It certainly is, and we certainly need to move in that direction. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our shows, you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're talking about the threats of nuclear weapons, and my guest is an expert on this topic. Ward Wilson is the founder and executive director of RealistRevolt. His latest book is titled, It Is Possible, A Future Without Nuclear Weapons. Ward, you were talking about treaties, and they're so critical. And of course, the United Nations has been on the front lines trying to eliminate all these small guns or control, let's just say that, so they're not a danger to other people, not to confiscate them, that type of thing, but also to get rid of nuclear weapons and a variety of, you mentioned chemical weapons. The Undersecretary General for the nuclear office, or the anti-nuclear operation at the United Nations, Ms. Nakamitsu, has been on my show a couple of times talking about this. What is the role of the United Nations in bringing the countries of the world together to not force something on them, but hopefully to get them to do the right thing and to develop treaties that are binding and that will move us in this downward spiral to get rid of these nuclear weapons, which are not only dangerous, they're extremely expensive?
International problems have to be solved by international institutions. And the role of the United Nations is vital. It's one of the reasons I think the United Nations is tremendously important in this way. You can see what an important role it plays if you look a little back at some of the history. For decades, advocates for nuclear weapons said that everyone basically wants nuclear weapons. The only countries that haven't built them are too poor or not technologically sophisticated enough. Well, that's not, I don't believe that's so. In 2017, the United Nations passed a resolution to begin a treaty process for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Every country that signs the treaty promises not to have nuclear weapons, not to build nuclear weapons, not to help people build nuclear weapons, not to have countries that have nuclear weapons put them on their soil, and so on. And 122 countries voted in favor of that treaty. So, and today, more than 80 countries have ratified the treaty. The treaty is in force. It only applies to those countries that have signed, of course. But what's crucial about it is that it has given all the countries that don't have nuclear weapons a voice and allowed them to put forward what they believe, which is that nuclear weapons are dangerous and they would never build them even if they could. And most of them can. If North Korea, which if you look at the GNP listing that the UN puts out, the gross national product for each country, North Korea is 113th. So if you subtract the 9 existing nuclear powers, that's 104 countries that could build nuclear weapons if they wanted to. I mean, they're richer than North Korea. So the fact is, lots of countries could build nuclear weapons, but they haven't. And what the UN has done by creating the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is to make that absolutely clear to everyone. The great majority of countries dislike nuclear weapons, think they're dangerous, wish they would go away. So I think the UN's role is crucial, and I think they've already done, an enormous step. Now we need to keep on going and go farther. Exactly.
And if our viewers would like to learn more about the UN programs, they can go to www.un.org. A moment ago, I mentioned not only are nuclear weapons dangerous, but they're very expensive. I remember years ago, and this has been at least 6 or 8, 10 years ago, seeing some statistics on how it costs the United States, just us alone, not the other 8 nuclear powers, but us, like $125 million a day to maintain our aging nuclear stockpiles that are aging even more today than they were back then. But not only are we paying all of this money that we could be putting into schools and roads to maintain weapons that are becoming very deteriorated and we can't use them anyway, and all probably we certainly wouldn't want to. We've got a situation now where the United States is talking about overhauling its whole nuclear weapon system. And they say, well, it will just cost us $1 trillion. Well, anyone who's dealt with the Defense Department and the government when it comes to these programs, I've got a bridge I'll sell you. That's all I can tell you on that one. It's absolutely ridiculous. How do you view just the financial costs, not to mention the human and environmental costs of maintaining these weapons?
Well, the financial cost is huge. I mean, between 1945 and the mid 80s, the United States spent $5.5 trillion on nuclear weapons. And we are about to spend $1 trillion more to upgrade them. And as you say, it was just announced this week in the news that the contractor responsible for upgrading our land-based missiles has come in and said, oh, well, actually, we kind of underestimated and it's going to be more expensive than we thought. And this is the problem. If you're a contractor and you're working on something that has been called vital to our survival, you know that any overrun, any increase that you demand will be met, because who would ever say, no, we can't pay these, we can't have the vital defense that we need because we can't pay these people. Of course, the fact is, I would argue nuclear weapons are militarily unusable, and deterrence is supposedly keeps us safe, although there's no way to actually measure whether that's so or not. Most people believe it does, but it's inherently flawed and will inevitably fail. So I think that buying nuclear weapons is a bad bargain, no matter what the price, and the astronomical price that we've already paid. There's no reason to throw good money after bad. We could build hospitals, we could build schools, we could build, we could take care of people in need. So
Exactly.
Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right. And the problem we have in this country, one of them is so many of the people in this country don't get the information that you get, and they don't, and it's not their fault. It's just not out there in many cases. And they don't realize that so much is being spent on these weapons that could literally eliminate every living being on the planet. And a lot of taxpayers, myself included, would not be happy to know $5 trillion, trillion, not billion or not million, $5 trillion were spent on these weapons that could have gone into building roads or schools or whatever. So it is truly a remarkable situation, and we have to educate people and provide more information. That is the problem right there, as I see it. One thing I want to get into before we get too far into the clock and run out of time. You have written a variety of other books, and I think it's in this book also that you contend that World War II was not won with the 2 atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And of course, that's when President Truman did that in August of 1945, as I recall. How do you perceive that? In fact, those are the only nuclear weapons, I think, that have ever been dropped. Am I wrong on that? But that's
absolutely right.
I think that's right.
And the thing is, here's the thing. We all know that experience, the best teacher is experience. And the problem with nuclear weapons is all of what we've done, all the money we've spent is all based on theory, essentially, because the weapons have only been used twice. And if you look at the experience of machine guns, which were invented in the 1860s, 50s, 60s, and then were used for 50 years. But by the time World War I came around, people still hadn't figured out how effective machine guns would be against troops charging over open ground. And it took 3 years and hundreds of thousands of soldiers dying in trying to charge across open fields before people understood how the weapon affected battle on the battlefield. We have none of that experience when it comes to nuclear weapons. So it's an almost unique thing in history that we are making policy based essentially on one piece of evidence, and that's the 2 uses in Japan at the end of World War II. Nuclear weapons have never been used on a battlefield. They've been used twice against cities in one war against one opponent, on one type of target, one set of atmospheric conditions, one type of geography in 1 week, and never used again. The problem, one of the reasons that it's possible for the value of nuclear weapons to be so overestimated is that there's no reality that sets in. There's no reality check that you can do because we never use them. I'm not advocating that we use them. I'm just saying we have to realize how unfactual much of the discussion about nuclear weapons is. And I'm sorry to do a long answer. I'm a historian. This is my thing. So
please go right ahead.
The theory is that Japan surrendered because they were shocked. the leaders were, amazed that 2 cities could be destroyed by just, 2 bombs. The problem with that, they weren't shocked. To begin with, excuse me, Japan's leaders were military men raised with an ethos of Bushido and a very harsh military code that came down from the samurai. And they weren't concerned about civilians. And that's not unusual in national leaders during wartime. Winston Churchill didn't insist that Great Britain surrender when London was bombed or Coventry was flattened. Hitler didn't surrender when Hamburg was burned or when Dresden was devastated. Joseph Stalin didn't surrender when Leningrad was surrounded and something like 1 million people starved to death, 1 million civilians. But the strongest evidence comes from China when in the summer of 38, the Japanese were making progress in central China, and Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of China, ordered that the dams on the Yellow River be blown. And it flooded almost all of central China. And it did, in fact, slow down the Japanese. But it also drowned 500,000 Chinese civilians. And Chiang, by his own order, killed 500,000 of his own people. So when important national goals are in view, national leaders during wartime don't worry that much about civilian lives. And if you look, there's a lot of evidence from the Hiroshima case, and I'd be glad if you bought the book and read the chapter on Hiroshima. They weren't worried about their cities being bombed. We'd bombed 68 cities that summer. And if you graph all of the people immediately killed in each of those attacks, Hiroshima was second. Tokyo, an attack with conventional bombs, was first. If you look at all the square miles destroyed, Hiroshima was sixth. If you look at the percentage of all the cities destroyed, Hiroshima was 14th. So they simply, and there's a ton of other evidence, but they simply they weren't that concerned. What bothered them, what made them surrender, is that the Soviet Union, which had a neutrality treaty with Japan, revoked the treaty on the night before they met to discuss surrender and said, we're in this war. They attacked with 1.2 million men, and they were planning to be in northern Japan in 10 to 14 days. And that's what made Japan's leaders, who were mostly military men and understood the odds. When a great power joins the war, it changes the situation. And so they preferred to surrender to the U.S. rather than the Soviet Union. I apologize for the long answer. This is what happens when you let a historian.
That's fine, but we've just about run the clock. And our last 30 seconds, what message would you have for our viewers as to how they should view this nuclear weapon situation and what they can do to make this world a safer place?
The most important thing is there's a taboo on talking about nuclear weapons because everyone believes that nothing can be done. The fact is something can be done. If we look realistically at nuclear weapons, and you can go to the website and there are resources and videos that you can look at, the fact is we can make a case, a powerful case, that nuclear weapons are dangerous and not very useful. Nuclear deterrence will fail ultimately because human beings are fallible. We make mistakes. And the only way that we'll be able to do this is if ordinary people who, and let's face it, we are the ones who would die in a war, a nuclear war. If ordinary people step up and insist that their political leaders overrule the elite experts in Washington and say, no, nuclear weapons are not that useful, and we want to spend our money on things that matter, on better military and better hospitals and all the things that make us safe and make life worth living.
Exactly. It's very true. Well, Ward Wilson, this is an important topic, and we're so delighted that you have a new book, and I encourage everyone to pick it up. But Ward, I want to thank you for a very interesting and a very, very important discussion today.
Thank you, Bill. It's great to be on again.
Okay, thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.